In just a moment, you can learn all about how Japan changed through the Meiji Restoration and how it invaded East Asia. Now, let's start Robin's record. The Meiji government promoted a civilization and enlightenment policy that actively embraces Western culture with the goal of enhancing the wealth and military strength of its country. It renamed Edo to Tokyo as the capital, merged the Han rule by daimyo to set up the prefectures, and carried out an abolition of the Han system, where the central government directly dispatched officials. In addition, the government introduced a Western-style education system and compulsory education, and set delegations to the United States and Europe to embrace modern culture. These people are called the Iwakura Mission, and it is said that half of the key officials were dispatched there for 2 years. In addition, it abolished the status system and implemented conscription to foster a modern army, and established a tax payment system in which the central government collects land tax in a lump sum to lay the financial foundation. As such, the Meiji government was committed to establishing a strong centralized system, building railways, establishing banks, and fostering commerce and industry. As a result of these efforts, Japan entered the modern capitalist economic system at the end of the 19th century. Meanwhile, as modern systems are implemented, the freedom and people's rights movement developed, demanding the introduction of a Western-style constitutional system. The government enacted the Constitution of the Empire of Japan to form a state based on a constitutional system. But soon, it suppressed the movement and gave the emperor political authority and command of the military to give him absolute power. The Meiji government embarked on an invasion of East Asia, imposing loyalty to the emperor and exclusive nationalism, with the traditional Shinto as the state religion. This was to resolve the contradictions and dissatisfaction caused by the modernization policy and to secure overseas markets by developing capitalism. Japan, which became powerful through the Meiji Restoration, began to have an ambition to conquer East Asia as it did during the Imjin War. Despite the achievements of the Meiji Restoration in Japan, there were many protests against the reform. The new military service system and education system put a heavy burden on the peasants, and as the samurai lost their privileges due to the conscription system, they revolted everywhere. The government tried to advance overseas in order to divert these domestic complaints abroad and to overcome the limitations of the small domestic market. And Seikanron was raised arguing that Joseon should be conquered, as it did during the Imjin War. Having decided to overseas conquest, Japan conquered Hokkaido, where the Ainu people lived, and took over the Kuril Islands through a treaty with Russia. And just as they had suffered from the United States, they signed the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876 with Joseon through the Ganghwa Island incident. Also, they began to show their ambition to seize East Asia in earnest, including annexing Ryukyu Kingdom into Okinawa Prefecture and invading Taiwan. After the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1876, Japan was at war with the Qing dynasty over control of Joseon and won the First Sino-Japanese War triggered by the Donghak Peasant Revolution in 1894. And they signed the Treaty of Shimonoseki, which ceded Liaodong Peninsula and Taiwan to them. With the Sino-Japanese War as an opportunity, Japan was able to intensify its interference in Korea's internal affairs. However, there was one country that kept Japan in check: Russia. Together with France and Germany, it returned the Liaodong Peninsula to the Qing dynasty through a triple intervention and tried to gain influence in Manchuria and the Korean peninsula. Then Japan formed an Anglo-Japanese alliance with Britain in 1902 to keep Russia in check, and in 1904, it hit Russia in a surprise attack and started the Russo-Japanese War. Russia's main fleet left the Baltic Sea for Vladivostok, which took 8 months. It was because Britain, which was dominating the world's major ports at the time, responded uncooperatively to the Russian fleet. It was the Japanese army who greeted the Russian fleet that came all the way to Tsushima Island after all these twists and turns. The Russian army, who was greatly defeated in the Battle of Tsushima, managed to reach Dokdo, but was annihilated by the pursuing Japanese forces. And the forces illegally seized Dokdo at this time, After the victory, Japan signed the Treaty of Portsmouth with Russia through the arbitration of the United States and was given the territory of Sakhalin Island, located south of 50 degrees north latitude north of Hokkaido. This laid the groundwork for Japan's invasion of the continent. After the victory in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan, which had been recognized exclusively for domination of Korea, signed the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1905, depriving Korea of diplomatic rights. Then, 5 years later in 1910, with the approval from Russia, Britain, and France, the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910 was forcibly signed, and the national sovereignty of the Korean Empire was taken away. On the other hand, in Europe, the First World War broke out in 1914 due to the confrontation between the great powers. Japan declared its participation in the war as an ally of Britain and occupied the Shandong Peninsula, which had been occupied by Germany. And to expand their power in mainland China, they tried to intervene in domestic affairs and invade interests by forcing the Chinese government to 21 demands. As this fact became known in China, anti-Japanese movements started, including a boycott of Japanese goods. Japan took a step back and gave up its interests in the Shandong Peninsula, but it did not give up its advance into the continent. Meanwhile, Japan, which colonized Korea, enforced the military rule with the Japanese military police. Under the influence of President Wilson's national self-determination principle, Koreans launched the March 1st movement in 1919 to call for national independence. As the demonstration for national independence spread across Korea, about 2 million people took part in 3 months, but Japan suppressed it with force. In the end, many casualties occurred, and with this incident, Japan implemented the cultural rule to divide our nation by raising pro-Japanese factions. When the Great Depression broke out in 1929, Japan caused the Mukden incident to take control of Manchuria in 1931. With the incident as an opportunity, Japan shifted to a militarism system in which the military came to the fore and ruled the country. Japan took over Manchuria and established Manchukuo with Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. When the League of Nations demanded the withdrawal of troops, Japan withdrew from the League and started the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. At this time, the Japanese army committed a massacre in Nanjing, the capital of China. The number of confirmed Chinese killed in this incident alone is 129,000, and the actual number is estimated to be over 300,000. The Second Sino-Japanese War was longer than expected by Japan and was in a deadlock situation. This was because the anti-Japanese resistance of the Chinese was fierce as the United States, Britain, and France supported the Chinese Nationalist Party. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Second World War began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1938. In June 1940, Paris was occupied by German forces, and as German victories continued in Europe, the Japanese military joined forces with Germany and Italy, and they advanced into Southeast Asia, occupying Vietnam, a route the United States, Britain, and France supported for China. Then, the United States banned all exports of strategic materials such as oil and rubber to Japan, and when negotiations with Japan turned to a hardline stance, the conflict between the United States and Japan grew out of control. How will Japan's fate unfold? When will peace come to East Asia? Robin's record will continue with the fifth part of Japanese history, the Pacific War, in which the US and Japan battled.